Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all sorts of content relating to true crime, education and psychology related topics. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, then please do hit that subscribe button and don't forget to turn on your little notification bell so you are notified whenever I upload a new video. Now, before we get started with today's case, I do just want to put a disclaimer at the start of this video. This case does involve the death of a young child, so if anyone out there doesn't want to watch any case relating to children, I completely understand. I just thought I'd give you a warning before going ahead into this case, just in case it upsets any of you. So if you don't want to watch anything, like I said, relating to children, then please don't watch this video. Definitely not for you, because it really is an awful and heartbreaking case. But for today's video, we're going to be discussing the case of Donna Sue Davis's death. And before we get started, I'm just going to zoom through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things. I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and get started discussing the case of Donna Sue Davis. The case of Donna Sue Davis takes place in Sioux City in Iowa in 1955 when she was just 21 months old. Donna Sue was a gorgeous little girl who had this bright blonde curly hair, and she was the youngest of 3 children born to James and Mary Davis. Her parents had told the authorities following her case that Donna's favourite things in the world were her teddy bear, a red bag that she owned and a rubber doll. Donna Sue was known throughout the local neighbourhood, and since her case occurring, she is often referred to as the darling of the neighbourhood. She was known to have such a sweet temperament, and she was always seen out playing with her older siblings and all the local children. Donna Sue's eldest sister, 11-year-old Mary Claire, would often be the one in charge of looking after her younger siblings whenever they wanted to go out and play with the other children. Mary Claire and her friends would spend a lot of their time walking around the neighbourhood they lived in, pushing around dolls and buggies with her younger siblings following on behind them. This case begins on July the 10th in 1955, when the day was looking to be impressively warm. On the evening of Sunday, July the 10th, Donna Sue was given a bath by her mother and then dressed in her pyjamas, and this had been at around 9:30 p.m. She was tucked into her crib in a room on the first floor of the 2-story home on Isabella Street in Sioux City. Inside this room, Donna Sue's bed was pushed right up to the wall at the foot of her parents' bed, with a wooden chest being placed beneath the bedroom window. Mary Davis kissed Donna Sue goodnight, made one last check that she had all of her favourite toys like her teddy bear within reach, and heads over to the window. With the unbearable summer heat and humidity, they found that the easiest way to tolerate the temperature was to leave the windows open to allow a breeze to provide some relief. And so when she left her daughter in her crib in the bedroom on the first floor, the window was left open. Mary headed back down to the kitchen, where she continued to read that day's newspaper while her husband had been watching the television in the front room. And in one room over, Donna Sue's 2 siblings were asleep. Something that's worth noting is the layout of the homes on the street that the Davis family had lived on for years. The Davis's family home was a duplex home that also housed another couple on the floor above theirs, so these were the McLeod couple. And just outside of the duplex home on Isabella Street was George Berger's property. His backyard faced directly onto the south end of the home that the Davises lived in. If George Berger were to sit in his backyard, he would be able to see the Davis children and their friends play in the space between the home and his yard. And this is exactly what he had been doing on the warm summer evening of July the 10th, 1955. At around 9:35 p.m, George Berger's attention was caught by something outside. It was a still evening in the quiet and friendly neighbourhood, and when George had spotted a man walking over the hedge located near the front of the Davis home, it had been an unusual sighting. The man had walked over the hedge and had been walking in a noticeably upright manner, according to George, and then he'd started walking along the south side of the building, the side that George's home had directly faced. George had attempted to continue to watch this man's movements as he moved around the home, but because of the time of evening, he'd struggled to see too much further. There had also been a point where his vision of this man had been blocked by the car that he had parked in his driveway. After a couple minutes, the man had reappeared in his vision and appeared to be retracing his steps and returning back in the direction that he'd appeared from. But what had been particularly unusual at this point had been that rather than just walking back down this path, he had been crouched down. A couple named Mr. and Mrs. Fieldos had lived on West 14th Street, and so the back of their property had met with the back of the Davises' property, separated by a number of trees. That evening, their dog called Rex had been outside in the garden and they'd heard him start barking at the door. Mrs. Fieldos had gotten up out of her seat to go and let Rex inside of the home, assuming he was barking to be let back inside. And as she opened the back door, she had turned on the light outside of the back door. As the light suddenly flicked on, she spotted a man appearing to skulk along the alleyway between the properties, and she claimed that he had been holding what appeared to be a bundle. Knowing something was not right, she shouted for her husband. Mr. Fieldos had grabbed a nearby torch and shined it directly at the man who had crouched behind a bush when he'd noticed the light turn on. They had previously had an incident a few weeks prior where their dog had alerted the couple to a man tampering with his car, and Rex had managed to scare the man enough for the couple to be able to ring the police. As a result of this incident, the couple had made several complaints about the lack of sufficient lighting around the neighbourhood, meaning that incidents like this were all too likely to occur. And because of this previous incident with the man tampering with his car, Mr. Fieldos had been adamant that he was not going to let this trespasser escape. Because of the bundle that he appeared to be carrying, Mr. Fieldos was initially convinced that he had been carrying around poisoned meat that he could then give to any of the neighbourhood dogs that might prevent him from going on any of the properties. And because of this belief, he tells his wife that she must keep the flashlight on the man while he runs inside and calls the police. A couple of minutes later, the Sioux City Police Department received the phone call from Mr. Fieldos, where he informed them that he had managed to corner a suspicious man outside of their home. But before the police could arrive at the home, the unknown man had fled through the alleyway and Mr. Fieldos had attempted to chase him. He followed him across West 14th Street and then into an alley heading towards West 15th Street before the man suddenly hid between two bushes in the backyard of 1417 Isabella Street, around a block away from the Davis family home. As Mr. Fieldos had gradually approached where the man had hid, he realised that the man was no longer there. He had just simply disappeared. Mr. Fieldos had later described to the authorities that the man had appeared to have been in his early 30s with a slight build and he'd been wearing a white t-shirt and khaki trousers. He noted that he had been running awkwardly because of what he had been carrying, and he stated that it seemed as though it was something wrapped in a blanket. At 9:40 p.m. back in the Davises' home, Donna Sue's father had decided to go up to the bedroom and check on her. At first, he doesn't see her and he initially assumes that she might have been hiding beneath the covers in her crib, but as he got closer, he realised that his 21-month-old daughter was not in her bed. He shouts to his wife asking where Donna is, but as he does so, he suddenly realises that the screen on the bedroom window had been removed completely and panic starts to set in. He immediately calls the police as he has not yet been aware that they were already heading out to the neighbourhood in response to one of their neighbours' call of a trespasser. And around this same time, a group of neighbours had been crowding around Mr. Fieldos as he had been telling them what he had just encountered. And then suddenly, this group of neighbours had heard a shout from Mary Davis inside her home screaming that her daughter was missing. Commotion had caused a large number of the residents in the neighbourhood to gather in the street as the police had arrived. George Berger had told them about the man that he'd seen crouching outside of the Davises' home, as well as Mr. Fieldos having explained his encounter. The Davises' upstairs neighbours, the McLeods, tell them that they hadn't heard anything unusual nor had they seen anyone out of the ordinary. And a number of neighbours had stated that they had seen this unknown man walking around the area, but all of them had struggled to provide a description of him as he appeared to be crouching slightly whilst carrying something in his arms. And immediately the neighbours had pieced together the disappearance of Donna Sue and the sighting of this unknown man, so they set out in search of the surrounding areas. Mr. Davis had jumped in his car and started to drive around the neighbourhood in a desperate search for his youngest daughter. And the day before, there had been an unexpected rainstorm, and because of the muddy roads in the area, he ends up getting his car stuck in a ditch. A resident of the nearby area named Sid Goldberg had been entirely unaware of the incident that had occurred. At around 10 p.m. that night, he had been driving through Elk Point in South Dakota when he'd seen a man in a white t-shirt and khaki trousers standing beside a black Chevrolet sedan. He noticed that the car had Nebraska license plates and that the man had been holding a baby in his arms. But as I said, at the time he'd been entirely unaware of the disappearance of Donna Sue Davis, and this information had not been known to the police until some time later. Around half an hour after this sighting, a woman living on the Old Back Road in Sioux City had heard an unusual commotion outside of her home that sounded as though a car had suddenly stopped on the gravel road just outside of her house before then suddenly speeding away. Somewhere around 11 p.m, Sid Goldberg had been listening to the radio when he'd heard the reports of the abduction of Donna Sue, and this is when he'd called the police to inform them of what he had seen. In response, the Elk Point Police Department were notified and officers were sent out to search the area in which he had seen the man holding the baby. But by the time the police had arrived, the man and the vehicle had gone. Sid Goldberg had been able to confidently recall the number plate of the vehicle he had seen, and so as the police were searching for information on the license plate number, a detailed description of the unknown man had been broadcasted over radios across Iowa, South Dakota and Nebraska. Authorities who had responded to the initial call had started to check for fingerprints inside of the Davises' bedroom in the hopes of finding some evidence that could aid their search for this kidnapper. Because of the nature of this case, everything had happened very, very quickly. As I'm sure you know, in child abduction cases, time really is of the essence. The Motor Vehicle Bureau in Nebraska had not been open at the time of the police hoping to search for information on the owner of the Chevrolet sedan, and so they hadn't been able to find the name of the owner at that point. And over the night of July the 10th, 1955, a huge amount of police officers were sent out in a large search of the surrounding area in the hopes of finding 21-month-old Donna Sue Davis. The following morning, the authorities had received a report that a farmer had heard a baby crying inside of a parked car with Nebraska license plates. This had been on a road just over 3 miles away from Highway 75, located near the areas of Sergeant Bluff and Salix in Iowa. Another tip arrived that stated a man carrying a bundle had been seen in an alleyway not far from 14th and Nebraska streets. He had been seen walking into a garage in this area before then leaving after a few minutes. And on this day, the search party had grown even more, with police officers, Air National Guardsmen and local residents having all volunteered. A woman named Mrs. Oleking had been inside her home in South Sioux City, Nebraska, while her husband had been out driving his tractor on a trip to buy oats. Behind his tractor, his nephew had been sitting inside of a wagon with 2 other local residents who often helped out with working on their farm. At around 3:45 p.m, less than an hour north of their farmhouse, he had noticed something inside of a ditch, and as he went to investigate, he realised he had found a pair of pink pyjamas from a baby's pyjama set and rubber pants made for infants to wear over their nappies. And after realising just how strange this finding had been, he had headed straight back to tell his wife and then to call the authorities. Mrs. Erliking had decided to head straight into the nearby town to pick up her daughter from the Girl Scout camp she was attending, but after the uneasy feeling after having heard of her husband's discovery, she first decided to stop at her sister-in-law's house. Mrs. Oleking, her sister-in-law, her niece and 6 children headed out in 2 separate cars to drive south on Old Back Road in their own search for the missing infant. They pass by the Oleking farm and continue in the direction of Dakota City. When around a half mile past their farm, some of the girls in the car began to scream, and they shout that they had seen a child's body. They halt the cars and back up to investigate the sighting. And this is where they discover the remains of Donna Sue Davis on the ground in the cornfield. The pink pyjama top she had been wearing had been wound around her neck, and she had bruising and marks around her eyes. Mrs. Oleking rushes the children home and calls the police, while her sister-in-law had stayed near the body. While waiting for her sister-in-law to return from calling the police, she finds an old paper sack in the area and covers up the child's body. Following the response from the police, Donna Sue's parents were called in to identify the clothing that had been found, and they had confirmed them to have belonged to their daughter. A search of the cornfield around where the remains had been found had shown signs of broken corn stalks, which led them to believe that she had been thrown from a vehicle. And the autopsy carried out on the remains had turned up even more troubling things. They had placed her death at being between 10 and 12 hours before discovery, and they realised that the poor girl had been sexually assaulted and had part of her jaw broken. There were a number of bruises all over her body, as well as what appeared to be cigarette burns. But aside from all of this, the cause of death had been listed as a massive brain hemorrhage resulting from a severe blow to the head. In the day following, the police had received a number of reports of potential sightings of the man responsible for the abduction and murder of Donna Sue Davis. One had been sent in by a truck driver that had seen a man matching the description on Highway 12 attempting to hitchhike. This had been in the area of Selby, South Dakota, and so in response a number of authorities were sent out in search of this area. But sadly this failed to lead to anything. On this same day, a number of fingerprints were found on the wooden chest beneath the window in the Davis' bedroom, and these were sent off to be compared to that of the Davis family as well as any other records. A warrant was filed that gave police officers anywhere in the country the authority to arrest anyone they believed to match the description of the suspect. On the 13th of July, a funeral was held for Donna Sue in a local church where nearly 400 people had attended to pay their respects. There were a number of detectives in attendance at the funeral, just in the possibility that the killer had decided to attend out of some cruel ploy. And by this point, the FBI were heavily involved in the search for the young girl's killer because of the awful nature of the attack. That same day, a man working in a car dealership had called the authorities out of suspicion that a man who had left his car with him had been potentially related. As it would turn out, this man had been 31-year-old Otto E. Wennekamp, and he'd brought in a car into the dealership and left it there in a new car under the pretense that he was driving this new car to go and pick up the money to pay for it. But he didn't return to pay for the vehicle that he had just left with, and so when the witness had checked inside the vehicle that he had dropped off, he noticed a number of cigarette burns on the dashboard, and this is when he called the police. Wennekamp was ultimately apprehended and questioned, but he was ultimately able to provide an alibi relating to Donna Sue Davis's murder, and he was only held on suspicion of auto theft. Later that afternoon, a drifter named Audrey Early Brandt had told officers that he had been the one to kill the infant. This confession was later recanted, following by him stating that it was all a hoax, and when police had learned that he had been in Missouri travelling with a carnival on the night of Donna Sue's murder, he was ruled out. I will just never understand why people could do such a cruel thing as to confess falsely to crimes like this when they fully well know what's at stake and how many people's hopes are riding on an investigation. A $1,000 reward is posted by a large newspaper company in exchange for information leading to the arrest and the conviction of the killer, but sadly nothing occurs in the investigation for quite a few months. On December the 10th, 1955, a 32-year-old named Virgil Vance Wilson was arrested in Reno, Nevada on intoxication and disorderly conduct charges. This man was originally from Iowa, and following his arrest he requested that he could speak directly to the police captain, and during this conversation he had confessed that in July of that year he had stolen a vehicle and then kidnapped, assaulted and killed Donna Sue Davis. He continued to go into detail about the attack on the child, and as a result the Reno Police Department had contacted the Sioux City Police Department. However, the following day, when an FBI agent had questioned him, he recants his entire confession and denies having any connection to the young girl's death whatsoever. As it would turn out, Virgil Wilson was actually in Des Moines at the time, and this had been confirmed by a group of acquaintances that he'd been in the company of at the time. With the times provided by these acquaintances, it was determined that it had been impossible for him to be in Sioux City at the time of Donna Sue's disappearance, and so he was ultimately ruled out. There were multiple other men reported to have been taken in by police for questioning and had taken part in lie detector tests, but nothing had come about from these possible suspects. I came across just one source in particular that listed Edward Wayne Edwards as being the man responsible for Donna Sue's death, but aside from this one source I couldn't find any other information linking him, so I'm not entirely sure how accurate this information is. And sadly, to my knowledge, there remains no new update in the hunt for Donna Sue's killer, and I genuinely do hope one day, for her family's sake, that they can get answers and that the person responsible is punished accordingly. This is possibly one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking cases that I've ever covered, and my heart goes out to Donna Sue Davis and all of her loved ones. And that is where I'm going to end today's video. As always, please do let me know your guys' thoughts of the case down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.